This is episode 73 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. I am pleased to be joined this week by Stanley Liebowitz. He is the Ashbel Smith Professor of Economics at University of Texas, Dallas. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Dr. Liebowitz.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so before we get started on what we're going to talk about mostly today, which is a study or studies you've come out with about the bias in current K-12 education rankings. Talk to me a little bit about your work more broadly. Based on a quick reading of your bio, you tend to focus, it seems, on economic policy. Is education something that you see or just working on through a economics lens, or do you have more work that you've done on education policy?
Well, actually, if you look at my record, you notice that I generally talk about other subjects. So I talk about something called network effects and the impact of new technologies on the economy and the impact of intellectual property laws on new technology. It just so happens that a few years ago I was reading a blog that was talking about some data that they had looked at, and Paul Krugman had written something in the Times about how terrible students were in Texas. And so this blog was by somebody in Iowa who said that if you broke down the scores, the students in Texas actually did better than the students in Iowa. And I remembered that and put it away and said, one of these days that might be worth looking at, because that's not what most of the world seems to believe. I'm constantly coming across insults to the state of Texas about its school system. And although I didn't grow up here, my kids went to school, and that's just my own experience, but it didn't seem like, at least the parts of Texas I was hearing about, was familiar with that bad. So we started a new center at UTD in the business school called CAFE, which is a free market type of center, and we got some money. And so one of the things we did was hire a research assistant to do a lot of work for us. And so I basically said, why don't you go out and get some data on schools, but do it for every state in the country instead of just comparing two, and let's see what the numbers look like, because there is a major problem with the way most of the rankings that people hear about, such as U.S. News and World Report or Education Week. I mean, those clearly aren't doing their calculations correctly. And the major problem that they encounter, there are two actually, but the one that I was focused on was the fact that they treat all the students in all the states as if they're the same as one another. So if one state has only upper middle class students and it's a small state, its school system is thought to be very good when those students do well on their tests. And another state, which may have many immigrant students who barely know English when they arrive at school, they actually, those students would have to learn a lot more to be up to get even, and they generally don't do as well on the exams. And those teachers are considered not as good, and the school system's not as good, really because the students coming in are different than the students in the first school system, which had only upper middle class students. So I thought we need to break down the type of students coming in and compare likes with likes across the states, and that would be a much better way of doing the analysis. The second, I think somewhat less important instance, is that Education Week and some of the other rankings count the amount of money that school systems spend as a plus. And school systems that spend more, just by itself, spending more is good as far as they're concerned. And you get a higher rank if the school system spends more. And I would think, and I think most normal people would think, that given a particular performance, the more you're spending, the worse you're doing. more bang you can get for the buck, the better the job that you're doing. And you shouldn't get rewarded for overspending, even though Education Week would over-reward you by lifting up your ranking just because you're wasting money. So those were the two things we tried to examine and correct for.
And you put your findings into one is a paper from the Cato Institute, Fixing the Bias in Current State K-12 Education Rankings. That was November 13th, 2018. And then a Reason Shorter magazine article, Everything You Know About State Education Rankings is Wrong. And you can find that if you go to reason.com. And so I really appreciate your taking on this very difficult issue. And we at the Rio Grande Foundation, we consider education just another part of the economy, just one that happens to be more heavily socialized than almost any other area of the economy that we are looking at in the United States. So talk about some of the challenges that you face in those education studies and why there's so many flaws with the existing research or rankings, if you will, and kind of where you took that in a different direction.
Okay. Well, I already gave you some of the problems, and the question was, how do we handle it and try to fix it? And what we wound up doing was deciding we did some investigation, and it turns out that many of the states that do very well in like U.S. News and World Report are in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. And many of those states have these particular characteristics that they have almost all white students. And so Maine would be one of those states, and Vermont would be one of those states. And they only do well because white students do better than minorities, Hispanic and blacks. And Asians, of course, do well, about as well as whites in many cases, sometimes better. So what we did was we broke the student body down into four different groups, blacks, whites, Asians, and Hispanics. And we compared the whites across states, the blacks across states, the Hispanics across states, and the Asians across states. We used what's called the Nation's Report Card, which is considered the best test to determine what students are learning in school. No school systems teach to that test, which is a concern about a lot of other tests, because not every student has to take it. And it's sort of randomly given to a group of students every year in particular states. And it's only done in the 4th grade, the 8th grade, and the 12th grade. But those are considered the best, most reliable scores of how much our students are learning. So they break those scores down for you by ethnicity. So basically what we did was let's take those two states I mentioned before, Texas and Iowa, and we compared, except we did it across 50 states plus the District of Columbia, how did the whites in Texas do to the whites in Iowa? How did the blacks in Texas do compared to the blacks in Iowa? And the same thing for Asians and Hispanics. And what we found is even though Iowa outscores Texas, if you just look at their overall score, the average score in Iowa is higher than the average score in Texas. Texas whites do better than Iowa whites, Texas blacks do better than Iowa blacks, Texas Hispanics do better than Iowa Hispanics, and Texas Asians do better than Iowa Asians. So Texas students in every category do better than Iowa students in the same category, yet Iowa's getting a higher score because in general, when these rankings are done, they don't disaggregate the data by the type of students that exist. So we did that for all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And we got results that were quite different than the results that you would find in U.S. News and World Report or Education Week. And those common studies are the ones that generally tend to frame the discussion, the national discussion we have about schooling. So Texas doesn't do well in those, which is one of the reasons why Paul Krugman's out there criticizing Texas. And Massachusetts and New Jersey and Vermont and Maine and a bunch of other Northeast states and some of the Midwest states do very well, according to the normal consensus. But when we redid it, comparing the students by their categories, New Jersey still does well, and Massachusetts still does well. But all the other Northeast states drop out of the top 10 or the top 15 and are replaced by states like Virginia and Florida and Texas and a few others that do surprisingly well, considering how bad their national reputation is. So you get a completely different story. Now, it's hard to know exactly what the word completely means there, but a story that's very different, and it certainly changes. It doesn't modify, but it completely changes the story of where the best school systems are. They are not primarily in the Northeast or the upper Midwest. In fact, the South has more than the North does in terms of the better school districts, in terms of states. So that's a major change. And then when we control for how much spending is occurring, we find that change is even enhanced. Now, most of the top 10 are from the South and Southwest, and the only one that remains from the North is Massachusetts, which comes in at number 10 in terms of the top 10. And so that's the result in terms of rankings. I should mention we did something else as well. Given that our measure of how students were doing on these exams was different than what you normally find, we thought it would be interesting to run an analysis across the 51 observations we had to see which characteristics were related to students doing well in the states. And we looked at characteristics such as the amount of money that was being spent per student, the strength of the unions within a state, the number of students per class, and a whole bunch of those other variables. And what we found, the two most interesting results, the two strongest results, were that unionization had a powerful negative effect on how well the students did, which is somewhat contrary to what the literature, the academic literature on this has found. That literature is usually mixed. They're not really sure. And much of it actually claims that unionization is beneficial. The second thing that we found was that the amount of money that states were spending on students, controlling for the cost of living, had no impact whatsoever on how well the students did. Now, that does not mean that spending has no effect on students. If you spent nothing, the students wouldn't learn anything because there'd basically be no system. What it means is that all the states basically are spending enough money that they've reached the point where additional expenditure doesn't seem to be helping the students. Maybe the additional expenditure for states that are spending more are on things that don't really go towards education. We don't know that. But what appears to be the case is the spending is not apparently having any influence, the extra spending now, on students doing.
Got it. Well, New Mexico, the state where I'm from, and we're doing this podcast, is a state that's both heavily Hispanic and heavily impoverished. And according to the NAEP data, also tends to be at the very, very bottom, literally 50th in most of these education rankings. But in terms of quality in your report, we move up to 41st. And then if you talk about efficiency, we move up to 33rd. I know you probably haven't spent as much time studying New Mexico as you have Texas, but can you shed any light on what that means for the overall system that we have in New Mexico? It seems like we're better than 50th, but we're still pretty poor overall in our education system.
I did take a look at those numbers before the call. And yes, you do come in 50th last on U.S. News and World Report. You come in better here, but still pretty bad. If you include District of Columbia, you show up 42nd. And so there's only like 9 states below you. So better than last, but no great shakes. The efficiency ranking is better because you don't spend that much money. You actually get as high as I guess if you're only using the 50, it'd be 26th. But when you use the cost of living, because you also have a lower cost of living in your state than is nationally the case, you go back to 34th, which is the more appropriate. So you're still in the bottom half. I took a look at unionization and the measure of unionization we have, and you'd have to look at the study to see all the sources that we had for data. says that the unions, the teachers unions in your state are not very powerful. And so that's wouldn't be the reason that your state's doing as badly as it is. And so I would wonder something is going on in your school districts where they're getting enough money that they could be doing a lot better. There are other states that spend less than you that are showing up in the top half, maybe even in the top 20 states. And here you are, in the 30s and 40s. I don't go into the details of the states. I don't know what's really going on, but somebody should, because you're below where you should be. You're below the average, and if it was unionization that was causing it, if you had strong unions, then you could point your finger at that, but you don't appear to have.
Now, what do you mean by strong unions? Do you mean just density in the education system, or is it to deal with laws?
It's supposed to be. We found a particular webpage that ranks unionization of educators in all the states. And they claim they look at more than just like the percentage of teachers who belong to the union or the amount of money that's raised in the union. They supposedly take a look at how influential the union is at influencing legislation in the state, how many lobbyists they have, stuff like that. And so I assume that they did a decent job in their measure of unionization. I can't attest to it because we found their webpage. We're using their numbers, but I don't really know much about them. But they claim that they did a careful job. And so those are the numbers we're using. And it does have a powerful effect overall.
Right.
But it claims that the unions in your state are not that powerful.
I've read that report now that you mention it, and it's hard to see what other states are like from a state that you're looking at, as an outsider and judge really. But I would say that the teachers unions are pretty strong here, but they may not be as strong as in some of the other more densely unionized states. So the other thing I really wanted to check in with you about is, this is a very Hispanic state, but unlike maybe many Hispanics around the country, a lot of the folks here are multi-generational, fluent in English, acculturated to the United States. I know that's probably a bridge too far in terms of trying to look at ESL versus more English fluent Hispanics, but is that something that you could see influencing the data, say Texas and Florida, which I would assume have much more recent immigrants versus a state like New Mexico with more of a static population of Hispanics?
Well, that actually, though, makes your numbers worse.
I know. I'm not averse to saying New Mexico is worse than even your data illustrate.
The fact is that we're treating all Hispanics the same, and a legitimate criticism could be made that not all Hispanics are the same. Some of them have been around a long time, some are from different locations than others. So the Cuban Hispanics were generally better educated when they came here, even though English may not have been their language. They tended to come from higher socioeconomic status. And so you might expect perhaps in Florida the Hispanics to do better than average Hispanics because of that. But we did not look into that. And that would be a hard thing to do because the data on that really don't exist. They only have data broken down by the basic ethnic groups. But it is something to look at. But as I said, if you don't have a high percentage of first-generation English-speaking, by the way, they do have that variable. We could have looked at, if I wanted New Mexico, to see what your percentage of first-generation English speakers would be, to see if it's lower than you might expect, as you just hypothesized. But I don't have access to that number at my fingertips right now, so I can't tell you.
Fair enough.
But if it's true, now I actually know a little bit about New Mexico, not much, but I summer in Colorado, in a little town just 50 miles north of the New Mexico border. So not that far from New Mexico for 4 or 5 months a year that I'm there. And we drive through New Mexico to go back and forth to Texas. But in southern Colorado, it's sort of similar. We have a lot of Hispanics of many generations ago was when they came. And so I presume that would be similar to certainly the northern part of New Mexico.
Yep. No, in many respects it is. And on poverty and income levels, you talk about that as a component of the efficiency index, but one of the things that we hear from our school districts and politicians is that New Mexico simply cannot compete based on having so many students in poverty. How do you?
Yeah, no, that's really, what we found is that our measures are almost identical to using measures of like school lunch being paid for and stuff like that, typical poverty measures. The breaking down by those four ethnicities picks up just about everything. Now, certainly at the state level it does. We can't say it does as well at the district level because we haven't looked at the district level data. But the state level, states with higher percentage of these minorities almost perfectly track the states that have the higher percentage of poor students. So that is something that we looked at. And the other thing is, we have other states that almost certainly have higher percentages than New Mexico, so as Texas being one, of poverty. And they do fine. Texas does great. So that is an excuse I wouldn't buy. I think maybe your school systems, if they're using that excuse, maybe they got away with it. But they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it because it's not true.
Well, that is not the first time we'll hear that kind of statement about the school districts and the education system in New Mexico. It's one that's definitely underperformed for a very long time, and they are full of excuses, unfortunately, with regard to student outcomes. Now, something that you don't... go ahead.
They might be correct that they do worse than average compared to other states that don't have any minorities, say, or don't have any immigrants. All right? But the fact is we're comparing their groups with other groups in other states that are similarly situated. And the fact is New Mexico's students in those groups are doing worse than those similar students in other states. And that there's no particular excuse for. It's not going to be able, it wouldn't work to say, well, they have more Hispanics, say, because the Hispanics are doing worse than Hispanics in other states. And so they would need to come up with a better excuse than that. So, one of the things is, one of the states that did really well was Maine in the overall usual rankings. And they dropped from in the top 5 to the bottom 5 in our rankings. And the story is why, and they have mainly white students. Well, it turns out Maine's white students do pretty badly compared to white students everywhere else. And the only reason they were scoring as well nationally was because the white students do better than any other groups, basically, and they have almost all of them and almost no minorities. So it was completely artificial that they were getting such a high ranking. But once you start comparing the groups with one another, it's a much fairer comparison to say how your teachers are doing in their classrooms. And New Mexico's teachers don't seem to be doing very well in their classrooms, even holding constant the nature of the students that they're teaching.
Right. And just to kind of clarify, the outcomes we're, of course, looking for here and that you use in an index are student growth. It's one thing to start out with a bunch of really smart kids and take them to a slightly higher level. It's another thing to take really smart kids and bring them up to a really high level, or kids that are struggling for a variety of ethnic and demographic reasons and take them up to a much higher level. So we're looking for improvement here, and that's the purpose that we're trying to instill in the education system. Is that an accurate statement?
That's what we would like to do. We think we're approaching that by comparing similar types of students with one another. And so if you have a group that's in almost every state, it's disadvantaged. So let's go to black students. Then you don't expect them to necessarily do as well if they're doing poorly before they get into schools. It's harder for the schools to bring them up. They're not going to do as well. That's why comparing blacks in one state with blacks in another state is a much more reasonable comparison than to try to compare blacks in a state with whites in another state, because they're coming in completely different averages in terms of their socioeconomic status. And so we don't actually measure the growth, but by looking at the groups and comparing the groups, we're approaching looking at the growth by sort of saying we're making them the same when they start. And if you make them the same when they start, then the measure you have of how much they know now is a measure of their growth. And that's the one way to look at the results we have. We also have science. Most of these rankings use only reading or only math, sometimes both. But we're using math, reading, and science because everyone says STEM subjects are so important now. And some of the states do surprisingly well in STEM subjects that you wouldn't think they might. And somebody can go look at that, why that would be the case. But we basically wanted to do this examination from like 20,000 feet, and I don't foresee us going into the individual states and looking at districts, and
Right.
largely because this has not been my subject of study for like the last 20 years of my life. I viewed this as something of a one-off. I knew there would be something there. I was pretty sure if I looked, and that's why we looked. And sure enough, I was pleased to find out it was there. But on the other hand, if enough people keep calling me up, so I had some organization in Arizona that wanted to know why their particular school district was doing so bad, and it was a large city, and so for them, I looked up the district because that was in the data set we had, and basically the district was virtually identical to the state numbers, so there was nothing new to tell them, but except for the big cities, it's much harder to get information on the little teeny districts that are out there at the level we're looking at. And to be honest, it's not the business I see myself getting into.
No doubt about it. Well, perhaps some entrepreneurial researcher out there could take this data and look at it with regard to something that Rio Grande Foundation and a lot of free market organizations really focus on, which is school choice. Now, paging through your quality, so just looking at the quality aspect, you don't see necessarily a direct impact in the area of school choice. I'll go through the top 5 and the bottom 5 states. This is from the Reason version, so they get rid of the District of Columbia. But top 5 quality, according to your rankings: Virginia, Massachusetts, Florida, New Jersey, and Texas. Now, Florida is definitely known as being a very choice-oriented state. Texas, not honestly so much, at least on the national level. And in the bottom 5, in order, are Louisiana, Arkansas, Maine, West Virginia, and Alabama. Now, Louisiana, famously after Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans school districts became charter schools. Arkansas, Maine, West Virginia, and Alabama, none of those stick out as being particularly choice-oriented. So any thoughts? Did you look at some of the school choice impacts on your data sets and how that impacted things?
Yeah, when we looked across the 50 states, we included the percentage of students in charters, and we included a couple of the other variables about how students were being educated in terms of choice. And while one of them had some statistical significance, the coefficient was very small. So basically the result we were finding was there was no particular relationship that we were finding between choice. And so vouchers was one, the percentage of students with vouchers, and how well the students overall did. Now, I can tell you we didn't really expect to find much there because vouchers are so different from one state to the other, and the way choice is run in different states is so different that it's not clear you're going to be able to pick anything up, even if choice did have an impact, because the measures of choice we have are not very good. So if you're getting a little teeny voucher that's not comparable to what the actual cost is, you don't necessarily expect it to have much of an impact on how well students are going to do. And so the fact that we didn't find much on choice was not something that really surprised us, even though our general view is we would expect competition to cause better results, and choice increases competition. But we didn't find that in our results, but we thought we might not. That's what we're sort of surprised how strong the union variable turned out to be.
Right. Well, one would expect that school choice and unionization are, inversely correlated in some regard, because choice programs generally are seen from a hostile perspective by the labor unions. So I'm sure it's a ripe field for study, though, no doubt about it. And kind of getting towards wrapping up here, I started out asking about the difficulty associated with measuring education systems across state lines, and I know it's it's something that you discussed, but wouldn't you say that because we have such powerful interest groups like the unions that would rather include spending data than actual educational improvement, and kind of the difficulty inherent in comparing and contrasting government systems across state lines? Don't you think there's some kind of public choice theory situation at work here?
No doubt that Education Week is basically, as far as I can tell, holding hands with the unions. And so they're going to think that anything that a government does that the unions like is a positive, and they're going to try to have it enter their rankings as a positive. Now, that's certainly the impression that I get. U.S. News probably claims they're more independent than that, and perhaps they are. But on the other hand, I think that they may feel that, well, if you're spending more money, you're trying harder. And so they want to give some additional credit for that. Just like they count the number of students in pre-kindergarten, preschool, as a plus when they're ranking K through 12. And it's like, well, sorry, but technically, K through 12 measures itself. That doesn't improve, it's not a measure of K through 12, it's how much pre-kindergarten they have. And they also have graduation rates as one of the pluses, when you can graduate in most states without taking any sort of exam to indicate you actually know how to read and write. And so those are measures that don't indicate what you've learned. And I think that they have a tendency to not want to use measures of what the students have learned, in part because they're very sympathetic to the unions and to spending more. They just think education is a good thing, which is true. And then they have this sort of simple-minded view that states should be willing to just spend whatever it takes to make the students better. And that's a sort of an irrational attitude when you realize that there's an opportunity cost to spending that money. And the idea is to try to get as much value from the money you're spending and spend the right amount to have your students learn a lot, but don't waste it. And I don't think they have drawn a distinction between wasting money and spending money.
No doubt about it. Well, it's New Mexico has had a lawsuit recently challenging the adequacy of our education spending. Unfortunately, the judge, acting as a legislature in and of herself, said that we don't have adequate spending, and I know your data would call that into question, but it does seem that it's a definite uphill battle. But I welcome your new data, your research, and the information that you've provided, and I really hope that we can start to chip away at this idea that more money is inherently going to improve schools. It's kind of like Consumer Reports saying that just because the new Mercedes or Tesla costs $50,000, that it's inherently better than the Honda Civic or whatever other automobile people are buying. It's kind of silly on its face, but in education, it seems to be the way things are done.
Well, that's right. Look, the U.S. is wealthier than other countries. There are a lot of countries out there. Now, again, they have their students come in perhaps with different ways of being students, but most of the countries that do better than us on these international rankings spend a lot less money than we do. And we have states that are spending less money that do well. I'm not saying that I have no doubt that if New Mexico increased its expenditure somewhat, because it is pretty low, and spent it wisely, that its students probably would do better. But it also could spend the same and spend it more wisely, and its students would do better. The key thing is there's no evidence you're spending it particularly well. Spending more, there's no reason to think that that's going to improve the formula.
No doubt about it. Well, we're going to find out. We're in the middle of a legislative session right now, and we do know we're going to get more spending in education. I suspect they will not spend it particularly effectively. But thank you for your time, Dr. Liebowitz. Thank you, dear listener, for tuning into this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work. And again, Dr. Leibowitz's study, Fixing the Bias in Current K-12 Education Rankings, can be found at the Cato Institute, or just Google that title. And the Reason magazine, Everything You Know About State Education Rankings is Wrong. Thanks again. See you next week.